That thug that's up in Maine, he's a thug. And they're trying to make excuses for him. I mean, he's worse than any human being that's ever run for office, probably. I don't know him, I don't want to say bad, but I just, look, I mean, nobody's ever had a record like that. And you'll have Schumer, he goes crazy over this or that, or Epstein. This guy, why are they talking about him? He said, well, we don't know, but this guy's got a rap sheet. I've never seen anything like it. He's a thug. I know thugs. I had to deal with thugs. I built a lot of buildings. I dealt with the toughest people on earth. I dealt with worse than thugs. This guy's a thug. He's a low-level thug. And he's running to be a senator, to work with Eric Schmidt. Great, Eric will handle him, I think. To be with Barrasso, who the hell do we have to be with Rand? Now, Rand would be very interesting with him. Rand would figure it out, and he'll put him away. But this is a thug. He's a cheap, no good person. And I watch these senators, the Democrats, and, well, we don't really know. You do know. He's as bad. I've never seen a person like that run for office.
Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough in political media. When a president's own team starts holding emergency meetings without the president, inside the most secure room in the White House, that's not just a leak. That's a signal, a very loud one. And right now, that signal is coming from inside the Trump administration. Loud enough that two of the most respected political journalists in the country put it in a book. Loud enough that the polling numbers attached to this story are genuinely stunning. Loud enough that Trump himself keeps responding in ways that make the story bigger every single time. So let's actually walk through what happened, what it means, and why the people closest to him appear more worried about the Epstein situation than most of the press has been willing to admit. Start with the polling, because the numbers set the stage for everything else. A survey conducted between June 3rd and June 8th, covering over 4,500 American adults, asked people a straightforward question. Do you believe the Trump administration has helped bring accountability in the Epstein case? The result? Just 10% of Americans said yes. That's not a partisan divide. That's a near universal skepticism. Even among Republicans, only 21% said they believe the administration has done its job on this issue. Think about what that means strategically. Trump's political coalition was built in significant part on the promise of exposing corruption, draining the swamp, going after the powerful people who escape consequences. The Epstein case was supposed to be the proof. Former Attorney General Pam Bondi publicly suggested that everything would be released, including a client list. That became a headline. It became a promise. And then it quietly didn't happen. None of the names that were supposed to come out actually came out. The files that were promised never fully materialized, and the base noticed. The same poll found that 84% of respondents, Republicans, Democrats, and independents in roughly equal proportions, agreed that the Epstein situation reinforced a broader belief that powerful people in this country rarely face real consequences. And 75% said they believe the federal government is still withholding information about the network. That's not a partisan number. That's a consensus. And when you have a consensus that crosses party lines, you have a political problem that doesn't respond to the usual deflection tactics. Now here's where the story gets structurally important. According to reporting adapted from a new book by Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan, titled Regime Change: Inside the Imperial Presidency of Donald Trump, approximately 10 days after the Justice Department and FBI released a memo stating there was no Epstein client list and that Epstein had not been killed in prison, the White House responded with something that felt less like governance and more like crisis management. Vice President J.D. Vance convened a meeting in the Situation Room, and the people in that room included nearly every major figure in the inner circle: White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, Communications Director Stephen Chung, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, then Attorney General Pam Bondi, then Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, and FBI Director Kash Patel. Some were there in person, others joined by phone. The president was not in the room. That detail is the one that deserves the most attention. The Situation Room is a national security space. It exists for genuine emergencies, threats to the country, military decisions, intelligence briefings. The fact that it was being used repeatedly, according to this reporting, for meetings about how to manage the political fallout of the Epstein files, and that those meetings were being held specifically without Trump present, tells you something about how those around him assessed his ability to handle the situation. The group's goal, per the Times account, was to design what the reporting describes as a gesture of transparency, something that would calm the frustrated base and signal that the president understood their concerns, even though the decision-making apparently reflected the opposite. Publicly, the administration was projecting control. Privately, there was something closer to paralysis. Let's add another layer, because there's a specific detail here that's almost cinematic in how revealing it is. J.D. Vance, according to sources who spoke to the Times, floated an unusual idea during these discussions. He reportedly suggested reaching out to Tucker Carlson and asking him to interview Ghislaine Maxwell in prison. The theory being that Maxwell might say, on camera, that Trump had no involvement in Epstein's crimes, which would then provide some kind of public exoneration. Sit with that for a second. That's not a legal strategy. That's not a transparency move. That's a communication strategy designed around the possibility of having a sympathetic interviewer extract a useful quote from a federal prisoner. Whether you find that approach reasonable or not, it tells you a great deal about how the people inside the building were processing the problem, not as a matter of historical record, but as a matter of optics management. Vance also apparently believed, like several others in the administration, including Kash Patel, that Epstein may have been murdered by powerful associates. He reportedly felt that the scandal was creating a serious fracture within the MAGA coalition, and that the better move would have been to release the full DOJ investigative file, essentially ripping the Band-Aid off, rather than continuing a strategy of partial releases and minimal comment. That internal disagreement never resolved cleanly, and the result is visible in the polling. Now let's talk about Trump's public response, because this is where the story becomes self-reinforcing in an interesting way. On a recent morning, the hosts of Morning Joe were discussing this new reporting. Trump, watching from wherever he was, responded, not by addressing the substance of the Epstein story, but by going on a lengthy tangent about Graham Plattner, a Senate candidate in Maine, calling him a thug multiple times, referencing Chuck Schumer, and circling back to Epstein only to dismiss the entire subject as something being weaponized unfairly against him. The political optics of that response are worth analyzing carefully. When a leader under scrutiny responds to specific allegations by pivoting to unrelated personal attacks, it creates a very specific impression in the audience, particularly among the people who were already skeptical. It doesn't answer the question. It creates a new question. Why is this the response? For the portion of the base that was hoping the Epstein files would eventually deliver the accountability they were promised, watching Trump lash out at Senate candidates instead of addressing the core issue is not reassuring. It's the opposite. And here's the strategic problem that compounds everything else. The more visibly frustrated Trump appears when the subject comes up, the more attention the subject receives. Journalists cover the reaction. Analysts discuss the reaction. Clips of the reaction spread on social media. Each cycle of attention brings in new viewers who then search for context. The Epstein story doesn't fade, it accumulates. There's a bigger structural point underneath all of this that's worth naming. The Situation Room meetings, if the reporting is accurate, represent something that goes beyond the Epstein story specifically. This isn't the first time reporting has suggested that Trump's advisors felt the need to manage sensitive conversations in ways that excluded him. What that pattern suggests, if it's real, is a White House operating with a significant degree of internal tension around how the president engages with certain categories of crisis. That's not a claim about character. It's an observation about institutional function. When a team consistently works around its leader on specific topics because they fear his reaction will make the situation worse, that's a management dynamic that tends to leak, attract reporting, and ultimately become part of the public record. which is exactly what appears to be happening here. The Haberman and Swan book draws on sources inside the administration. The New York Times ran an adaptation. The details are specific: names, meeting locations, strategies discussed. That level of specificity doesn't typically come from generalized animosity toward a subject. It comes from people who were in the room, or adjacent to it, who decided this story needed to be told. The question the administration hasn't answered, and the one the polling suggests most Americans are still sitting with, is a simple one. If there's nothing significant to reveal, why has the handling of the Epstein files created this level of internal crisis? Why do emergency meetings get called in secure facilities when polling drops? Why does a sitting vice president reportedly float the idea of using a prisoner interview as a political communications tool? Why does the president respond to questions about the files with escalating personal attacks rather than a substantive account of what has or hasn't been done? None of those questions have clean answers right now, and in the absence of clean answers, speculation fills the space. The 75% of Americans who believe the government is still withholding information didn't arrive at that number arbitrarily. They got there through a long sequence of promises, reversals, partial releases, and visible discomfort. The administration has the power to change that narrative. What the current moment makes clear is that the strategy of managing the story rather than resolving it hasn't worked. And based on the polling, it's losing ground inside the coalition that was supposed to be most forgiving. This story isn't going to reach its conclusion anytime soon. There are too many open threads, too many unreleased documents still being discussed, and too much public interest now anchored across party lines. What we can say is that the internal picture being painted by this new reporting is significantly more complicated than what's been visible from the outside. If you want analysis that stays focused on strategy, context, and the details that actually matter, subscribe and stick around. There's a lot more of this coming.